My name is Emma Carter, and on the day my sister graduated, they told me to wait outside. I arrived early that morning. Too early, probably a habit I picked up from my time in uniform. I parked 4 blocks away because the main lot was closed off, then walked the rest of the way in the June heat. The stadium was already buzzing clusters of families in colorful summer dresses and pressed suits, hugging, laughing, posing for photos. I had called ahead. I even emailed. No one replied. Still, I showed up. I wore a simple black dress and a plain jacket, nothing flashy. No insignia, no bars, no hints of who I had been or what I had done. Just Emma. Just the forgotten sister trying not to be late. At the guest entrance, a student volunteer handed me a program without looking. I scanned the names. Abigail Carter, 4th row, magna cum laude. I should have felt proud, but all I felt was distance. As I approached the reserved seating section, I spotted my mother waving at someone across the aisle. My father had his phone out, already snapping photos. And there she was, Abigail, radiant in her maroon cap and gown, surrounded by people who adored her. I stood by the edge of the rope, hesitant. Then my mother saw me. She didn't smile. She didn't wave. She walked over half a step too quickly, as if to intercept me before anyone noticed. "There's not enough space, Emma," she said flatly. "You'll have to wait outside the barrier. We only got 5 seats. I blinked. "There's plenty of room," I said, nodding toward a dozen empty chairs. She crossed her arms. "They're for family." I opened my mouth, then closed it again. "Right. Of course. I'd forgotten I wasn't family anymore. Not really. Just the dropout. The disappointment. The one who didn't finish college, who joined the military instead of law school, who sent postcards from dusty outposts but never came home for the holidays." Behind her, I could see Abigail laughing, holding her diploma cover, showing it to our aunt like it was made of gold. My father was now filming everything. Everyone had their place, their script. Except me. "I'll just stand," I said. My mother looked relieved. "Thank you." She turned away before I could say anything else, so I stepped back past the rope line into the general crowd. No one followed. I found a shaded spot beneath a tree, close enough to hear the ceremony, but far enough to stay unseen. From where I stood, I could just make out the stage. There were rows of folding chairs in the sun and a podium wrapped in the school's banner. The orchestra started tuning. Chatter died down. Parents guided restless kids into seats. And I stood there on the outside of it all. Not angry. Not yet. Just hollow. Like I was watching someone else's memory unfold in front of me. As the ceremony began, I listened to the speeches. The headmaster's voice echoed over the PA system, full of platitudes about the future, about legacy, about family pride. I wondered if they would say my name. They didn't. They said Abigail's 3 times. Once when announcing the honors, once when she accepted her scholarship, and again when she rose to speak as student representative. Her speech was perfect, poised, polished, just like her. She said all the right things. About resilience, about sacrifice, about dreaming big and never giving up. I nearly laughed, not because she lied, but because no one noticed how much she had borrowed from someone else's life, from mine. I had lived those words, bled for them, starved for them, buried people who carried them like armor, and yet here she was wearing them like pearls around her throat. At one point, she looked toward the general audience and said, "To those who supported me from afar, thank you. I carried your strength every day." My mother cried. My father beamed. I stared at the back of her head and wondered if she even meant me. After the ceremony, as the crowd surged forward for hugs and pictures, I stayed under the tree. I saw my family gather in a tight circle, posing, smiling. Champagne flutes appeared. Someone brought a small cake. A printed banner was unfurled. "Congratulations, Abigail." I waited. 5 minutes. 10. No one looked for me. No one remembered I was there. I checked my phone. No texts, no missed calls. I was invisible. And still, I didn't leave. Because part of me, the part that had once prayed to be wanted, still hoped someone would turn around. That they'd realize they'd forgotten the only person who had ever stood between their peace and a war. But no one did. So I turned around and walked away. I didn't cry. Not then, because I had already learned some tears are too old to fall.
Some wounds too deep to bleed again.
And some people never deserve to know who you became after they stopped seeing you. I didn't go home after the graduation. I walked. Just walked. Past the parking lot down the tree-lined streets of my hometown, shoes-pinching eyes fixed on the sidewalk, like it might offer answers. It didn't. Nothing ever does not really. There's a silence that lives in small towns, one that trails behind you like an echo. I hadn't been back in years, and yet the cracks on the corner of Jefferson and Pine were still there, right where I remembered scraping my knee in 5th grade. The bakery still smelled like vanilla. The gas station still sold old postcards no one bought. The church still rang the noon bell. Everything had stayed the same, except me. I found myself outside the old bus station, the one I had stood in front of the day I left. I remember the feeling, a duffel bag at my feet, an acceptance letter to the army tucked under my jacket, and my mother's words still ringing in my ears. Don't come back until you've made something of yourself. So I didn't. I made something of myself. Quietly, completely. In deserts and jungles and foreign cities I can't name. I trained, I led, I bled, I buried. I became someone the old Emma wouldn't have recognized, someone who stood her ground when bullets flew, who spoke with clarity in chaos, who earned respect through silence, not screams. And yet when I came home, I was invisible again. That day after graduation, I booked a room at the only motel that didn't reek of mildew. The clerk didn't look up. I paid in cash. That night, I sat on the edge of the bed holding the program from the ceremony. Abigail's name in gold letters. Honors, distinction, future doctor. It was beautiful, polished, official. I folded it in half and put it away. Not out of bitterness, but because I was tired of feeling like a shadow in someone else's success. I turned off the lamp and stared at the ceiling. And that's when the memories started pulling at the seams. There was a time years ago when Abigail and I were inseparable. Before high school, before expectations. We built forts out of blankets. Played soldier in the backyard. I was always the general, she, the giggling medic. She used to write my name in glitter pens on her notebooks. Emma is my hero, one read. Somewhere that version of us stopped existing. Maybe it was the day I came home with a shaved head and dog tags, and she said, "You really did it." Or the day our father said, "You know your sister's making something of her life," and no one corrected him. Or maybe it was just a slow drift. One silence after another. Until there was nothing left to say. I turned on my phone. Still no messages. I scrolled through the old photos I had never shown them, pictures from Kandahar, from a jungle base in South America, from that winter mission where we pulled civilians from rubble at 2 a.m. Faces covered in soot, arms, linked eyes that had seen too much. I zoomed in on one. Me, kneeling next to a boy no older than 5, blood on my sleeve and smoke still curling in the background. That day, I carried him half a mile on my back. No one in my family ever asked where I was that year. They were too busy worrying if Abigail's prom dress would arrive in time. I lay back down and closed my eyes, but I couldn't sleep because something inside me had started to shift, a quiet, burning anger, not at them, but at myself, for accepting it, for shrinking, for letting them erase me without a word. And I made a decision. I would go back, not to stay, not to beg, but to remind them, not through words but presence, that I was still here, still whole, and far more than they ever chose to see. The next morning, I ironed my uniform. Not the one I wore in the field, the one I wore for dignitaries, for fallen comrades, for ceremonies so heavy they silenced entire cities. Navy blue, medals aligned, boots polished to a mirror. I pinned every earned honor where it belonged. I looked in the mirror and straightened the collar. Emma Carter, ranked, decorated, recognized, but still a daughter, a sister, a woman they'd rather forget. And now, the one they couldn't ignore. There was still a celebration happening that evening, a private party at a banquet hall downtown. My mother had posted about it, not knowing I saw everything she made public. I smiled. Let them celebrate. I was coming. And this time, I wasn't arriving in silence. The banquet hall was dressed in gold and crimson, Abigail's chosen colors, or rather our mother's. A giant banner hung across the entrance. Congratulations, Dr. Abigail Carter, though she was still years from earning the title. It didn't matter. In their eyes, she already was everything. I stood just outside the double doors listening. Laughter. Champagne glasses clinking. A DJ spinning a soft track that echoed faintly through the parking lot. I waited a moment, allowing myself one last breath, not to calm nerves, but to gather memory. To center the version of myself they never bothered to meet. Then I walked in. The sound didn't stop immediately, not like in the movies. It took a second. Maybe two. A gradual hush that spread like a ripple. Heads turned. A few gasps. One voice I couldn't tell whose whispered, "Oh my God." I didn't flinch. My boots clicked against the polished floor, steady, unhurried. I walked past the tables, past the stunned faces, past my own aunt, who dropped her fork mid-bite. My eyes didn't search for anyone. Not yet. Let them search mine first. I stopped in the center of the room. And that's when I saw her Abigail in a red cocktail dress glass in hand mid-laugh. Her smile froze. She blinked once, twice, then straightened her shoulders, like she wasn't about to be blown off balance. Our mother stood beside her, pale. Our father, standing near the cake table, dropped his napkin. No one spoke. I looked around the room and smiled gently. Not wide, not boastful, just enough to make them wonder if they had dreamt me up. "Evening," I said. A few people nodded. Most were too stunned. I stepped toward the center of the room, toward the podium someone had set up for toasts. I didn't touch the mic. I didn't need to. I simply stood there, tall, in uniform, medals glinting under the chandeliers. They could read me now, the titles, the campaigns, the years. Abigail was the first to recover. "Emma," she said, her voice too bright. "You came." I nodded once. I did. She walked over carefully in heels she didn't quite trust. "I didn't think you'd—" I wasn't invited. A beat passed. She didn't deny it. "Well, I'm glad you're here." "Are you—" she faltered. "I mean, of course." We both knew it wasn't true. But I wasn't here to expose lies. I was here to be undeniable. The silence held, thick, electric. Then our uncle, the one who once told me joining the military was a waste of a good brain, cleared his throat. "Emma, we had no idea you'd well look at you." I turned to him. "It's been 11 years, Uncle Jack." He shifted. "Yes, well, time flies." No one else spoke. Not our cousins who used to tease me for being tomboyish. Not our grandmother who had once told me I'd never find a husband if I kept scowling. No one offered a hug. No one said welcome back. I didn't expect them to. Because this wasn't about reunion. This was about reckoning. The DJ had stopped the music by now. The servers had paused mid-step, holding trays of canapes that no one touched. I looked at Abigail again. She was staring at my chest, at the medals, the ribbons, the insignias she couldn't name. She tried to smile. "You look impressive." I said nothing, because that word impressive was too small for what I had lived through. And too late. The hall began to shift. Whispers. Murmurs. People piecing it together. A few stood straighter. A few actually saluted awkwardly, unsure of the protocol. But two moved not to try. Then something happened I didn't expect. One of the deans from Abigail's college stepped forward. He was an older man, tall, silver hair glasses he kept adjusting. He extended his hand. "Commander Carter," he said. "We didn't realize—" I shook his hand. Firm, quiet. He turned to the room. "Ladies and gentlemen, please, may I suggest we give proper recognition." The dean stepped back. And then slowly, hesitantly at first, the crowd rose to their feet. Chairs scraped. Glasses clinked. Hands lowered. Conversations stopped. They stood. For me. Not because I demanded it, but because they finally saw me. No longer the dropout. No longer the disappointment. Not even just the sister. I was the one who served, the one who endured, the one who came back whole, even after being forgotten. I didn't bow. I didn't wave. I just stood spine straight and nodded once. And that was enough. I saw my mother's eyes shimmer. Not with tears of joy. with something else, recognition, maybe even regret. And Abigail, she stepped back into shadow as the spotlight shifted, not because I wanted it, but because she finally understood. This was not her moment. It was mine. I didn't stay long after the applause. 10 minutes, maybe. Long enough for it to settle in, for people to whisper, to look at me differently, to realize I wasn't just Emma anymore. I wasn't the ghost in the background of their family albums. I was the presence they never prepared for. But that was never the point. I didn't show up for applause. I showed up because I needed to look them in the eye one last time and see if they'd blink. They did. When the dean sat back down and the music cautiously resumed, the room didn't return to its earlier noise. It never could. Something had shifted. Even the air felt different. I nodded politely to a few people, offered quiet thanks to the ones who had stood with genuine warmth in their eyes. Not everyone meant it, but some did. Some had the decency to see past the stories they'd been told. I moved to leave, but just before I reached the door, Abigail caught up to me. "Emma, wait." I paused. She looked conflicted. Not angry, not sad. Something in between. "I didn't know," she said softly. "About all that." "All what?" "You," she said. "What you've done." I tilted my head slightly. "You could have asked." She swallowed. "I didn't think you'd want to talk." I nodded. Maybe I didn't. But that's the thing, Abby. Silence doesn't always mean absence. Her eyes dropped. I waited. I wasn't angry with her. Not really. I didn't come for revenge. I didn't want her to beg or break. I just wanted her to feel for once what it meant to be on the outside of someone else's triumph. She looked up again. "I'm sorry." And for a moment, I believed her. But then she said, "I hope this won't take away from today." And just like that, the air thickened. I smiled, small, tired. "Don't worry. You'll always be the star of your own show." I walked away before she could say anything else, because I knew what she meant. She wasn't sorry for forgetting me. She was sorry I showed up to remind her I still existed. Outside, the sun was lower now, casting golden light over the cars, the city skyline in the distance, the tops of trees. I took a long breath. The warmth of the evening pressed into my uniform. The medals were heavier now, not because of their weight, but because of what they carried. The years, the silence, the scars. I drove to the motel in silence. No radio, no calls, just the hum of the engine and the slow, steady return of myself to myself. In the room, I took off the uniform, carefully folding each part as if it were sacred, because it was. Every ribbon, every insignia, every crease told a story I had never spoken out loud. I ran my fingers across the fabric. It still felt like armor, but I wasn't going into battle anymore. I sat on the edge of the bed in my undershirt and slacks and stared at my reflection in the TV screen. My face looked older, not tired, just lived in, like every inch had earned its place. And then I did something I hadn't done in a long time. I wrote, not a report, not a field update, not a resignation or transfer. A letter. To myself. I wrote about the girl who used to stand outside locked doors waiting to be let in. I wrote about the woman who finally built her own house. I wrote about quiet strength and how it never asks for recognition. And then I burned it. Because some words are meant only to be released, not remembered. Later that night, there was a knock on my motel door. I didn't move at first. Then I opened it. My mother stood there, hair pinned, makeup still on. But the lipstick had faded and the eyeliner had bled slightly at the corners. She looked smaller than I remembered. For a second, neither of us said anything. Then she spoke. I don't know what to say. I nodded. You don't have to say anything. She stepped inside slowly, cautiously, like she wasn't sure she had the right. I didn't know, she said. I didn't respond. I didn't understand. What you'd done? What it meant? Still, I said nothing. She looked around the room, plain, clean, impersonal. This isn't what I wanted for you. And there it was. I smiled faintly. What did you want? A better life, she whispered. A safer one. I had one. She looked at me, really looked at me for maybe the first time in a decade. You're different, she said. No, I'm just visible now. She nodded slowly. And then she said something I'll never forget. We were wrong. It wasn't everything, but it was enough for me to sleep that night with peace. Not because they had finally accepted me, but because I no longer needed them to. The next morning, I packed early. There wasn't much, a few clothes, my uniform, some paperwork tucked into folders I hadn't opened in weeks. I moved quietly, deliberately, as if each motion stitched something back together inside me. I checked out of the motel without saying a word. Outside, the air was crisp with early summer heat. Birds were already calling, and the town felt like it hadn't noticed what had changed. But I had, and that was enough. I didn't plan to say goodbye to anyone. There were no loose ends worth tying. What needed to be seen had been seen. What needed to be heard had already been said or left in silence, which sometimes speaks louder. But as I passed Jefferson Avenue, the same street where I once waited for the military bus as a teenage girl with trembling hands, I slowed down. There was a small park across the street. It used to be our sanctuary, mine and Abigail's. Back when we were kids, before opinions, before sides. Back when being sisters meant something simple: I'll sit beside you even when you're mad. I pulled over. The swings were rusted now. The jungle gym had been replaced by safer plastic structures, bright and rounded. But the bench, that old iron bench under the maple tree, was still there. I sat, and for the first time in a long time, I allowed myself to feel the weight of what we had lost. I wasn't grieving a family. I was grieving the girl I had been, the one who believed that love was automatic, that family meant shelter, that effort equaled affection. I sat there for nearly an hour. No phone, no photos, just memory. I remembered how I used to write letters home during deployment, careful not to include too much, never the worst of it, always filtered gentle. I remembered how I waited for replies that never came. I remembered Christmases spent in mess halls overseas while Instagram showed me my family toasting champagne under golden lights. And I remembered how I trained myself not to mind. But sitting on that bench now, I realized something: I had never fully let myself be angry. Not rage, not blame, but the quiet anger, the kind that hums beneath your skin, that eats away at your voice, that convinces you not to ask for what you deserve. That anger had made me small, smaller than I ever should have allowed. And now, I was done being small. I stood and walked back to my car. My phone buzzed. A message. From Abigail. Can we talk before you leave? I hesitated. Then type, "You had 10 years." And hit send. I didn't owe her a conversation. I didn't owe anyone anything. Not after being the only one who'd ever walked into war for strangers, while my own family forgot my birthday. I drove through town one last time. Past the bakery, the school, the empty field where we used to play tag until dark. I didn't feel nostalgic. I felt complete. By noon, I was back on the highway headed west. Not to a base, not to an assignment, to a meeting, a private one. Some people assumed I was done serving the moment I showed up in formal dress. But what they didn't know, what they could never guess, was that my uniform wasn't just for show. I was still active, still classified, still needed. At 3:00 p.m., I pulled into a discreet government building 2 states away. I showed my badge, walked through 3 levels of security. No one saluted. No one asked questions, because everyone already knew. They called me ma'am. They handed me a folder with a red stripe, and they waited, because the same woman who had stood alone at the edge of her sister's ceremony, was the same woman they trusted to lead an international negotiation behind closed doors next week. I flipped through the contents of the file. Names, maps, timelines, all things far removed from maroon gowns and graduation speeches. This was my world. This was where I was never forgotten. I closed the folder, took a breath, and stepped into the conference room like I belonged, because I did. Because I always had. They just didn't see it, but they would, soon. The room was sealed, frosted glass, soundproof walls, the kind of space that doesn't exist on public blueprints. I sat at the head of a narrow table, 6 others across from me, each in uniform, each older than me, each waiting. Not because of rank, but because I was the one they called in, the only one who had done this before. I looked around at their faces, skeptical, tired, precise. These were people who had seen too much to be impressed easily. I opened the folder and began. This contact is unstable, I said, tapping a grainy photo. But she's the only one who has access to the shipment's exact location. If we lose her, we lose the entire corridor. A colonel leaned forward. Why you? Because I'd earned their silence. Because I'd already done this once in a place no one wanted to talk about. Because I was the only one she trusted. But I didn't say any of that. I just looked him in the eye and replied, because she gave my name. No one else's. He sat back. Respect isn't granted in places like this. It's pried loose through fireblood and unshakable calm. And I had all three. The meeting lasted an hour. We reviewed protocols, contingencies, extraction windows. There was no time for mistakes. This wasn't about revenge. This wasn't about redemption. This was what I was born to do. When it ended, they didn't clap. They nodded, which in this world meant everything. I stepped into the hallway, still in uniform, though I was already exhausted. Not physically, something deeper. That feeling when you've been dismissed for so long that even recognition tastes bittersweet. I pulled out my phone. Another message. From Abigail again. I know you're angry. I was just trying to protect my day. I didn't want you to feel like a stranger. I stared at the screen. What did she think I'd been feeling for the last decade? I didn't respond. I walked outside where the sun had dipped behind clouds. A storm was coming. I could smell it, ozone and quiet tension. I liked that smell. It reminded me of the desert, of before. I walked across the lot to a quiet corner near the flagpole. No one else around. And I allowed myself for the first time in a long while to feel proud. Not in a loud way, not in a look-at-me way, but in the way a soldier feels when the mission is clear. When you've lived through hell and still remember how to stand. I leaned against the concrete and closed my eyes. Somewhere back home, they were still recovering from the night before. My mother might still be replaying my walk across that banquet hall in her mind. My father probably silent. That was his way. Abigail. Maybe she was crafting the perfect apology. One that wouldn't admit guilt, but would make her feel better about not inviting me. But none of that mattered now, because I wasn't in their world anymore. I belonged to a different realm, now one of Shadow's codes, high-stakes diplomacy. And they couldn't follow me here, because here I was not their disappointment. I was their protection. They would never know how many nights I stayed awake in some crumbling compound just to keep intel flowing to a satellite that watched over their borders. They would never know how many names I memorized, how many I couldn't forget, how many I buried under fake identities so that their airports could remain safe and their parades uninterrupted. They would never know the weight of silence I carried, because if I spoke, lives would shatter. So I stayed quiet. Let them think I was cold. Let them think I was distant. Let them think I was lesser. Because distance is what kept them alive. I looked down at my hands. Steady, strong. Once Abigail had held these hands after scraping her knee. Once my mother had kissed them goodnight. Now they opened briefings that could topple governments, and still not one of them had asked where I'd been all this time. I didn't blame them. People fear what they can't explain. And I was no longer explainable. Just then, a voice crackled through my earpiece. Ma'am, the transport is inbound. You're needed on site in 30. I tapped twice to acknowledge. Mission clock ticking. Rain starting to fall. I walked toward the black SUV parked at the edge of the lot. A young agent opened the door. Commander Carter, he said. Welcome back. I nodded. Back to duty. Back to the world that saw me not as a shadow in a family photo, but as the one person they could count on when everything else failed. As I climbed into the car, I allowed myself one final thought. Let them host their parties. Let them toast their degrees. Let them forget. Because when the storm finally hits, they'll remember the one who walked alone into the dark to keep them dry. And this time, they won't be able to look away. The safe house wasn't marked on any map. It sat just outside a border town that didn't officially exist, a cluster of red-roofed buildings, old stone, and long-forgotten roads. From above, it looked like an abandoned monastery. From inside, it was a nerve center. I arrived at 0430. Still dark, still raining. The kind of rain that doesn't cleanse, just soaks silently without apology. They were waiting. Not a full team, just 3. Commander Novak lean and ageless nodding without smiling. Agent Ruiz chewing on a pen, like always. And then there was Lieutenant Park Young, serious, sharp eyes that never stopped scanning. "Ma'am," Novak said as I entered. "Briefing's ready?" I peeled off my wet jacket, let the cold settle in my bones for just a second. The silence between us was routine, not awkward. This was how people spoke when they had no time to pretend. I stepped to the screen. Photos, names, coordinates, danger zones, blinking red. "She'll be here," I said. "She always is, right before the storm." No one questioned it. They knew I wasn't guessing. Because she and I had history. The contact code name Halcyon was a former informant turned freelance broker. Once a student in Prague. Now a ghost in 4 languages. She had burned others. Never burned me. Why I never asked? Trust is a strange currency. I paid it in silence. We worked through the night. No breaks, no distractions. Just extraction routes, encrypted frequencies, recon passes, contingencies upon contingencies. By Oro 600, I was suited up again. But this time, not for a stage. Not for a crowd. For the real world. The one where medals don't shine and applause doesn't echo. Only outcome matters. Outside the SUV waited. Rain had become mist. Sky still bruised by night. Ruiz passed me a device. If she runs again, she won't. He didn't argue. I got in. Park drove. We didn't speak on the way. Just the rhythm of tires on gravel, and the knowledge that some missions aren't missions, they're memories repeating themselves. I stared out the window, watching the fog roll over hills, thinking of Abigail, of how she cried when she didn't get into Yale, of how I sat with her that night, both of us curled on the kitchen floor, eating frozen cakes straight from the box, of how she never once asked where I went after high school. Not really. Just assumed. Must be nice, she had said once, to escape. Escape. That's what she called it. As if war was a vacation. As if disappearing from your own family tree was some selfish indulgence. I closed my eyes. Let the anger pass like weather. She didn't know. None of them did. We reached the coordinates at 6:50. A broken villa, ivy covered, forgotten by time. She was already there, Halcyon. Leaning against a wall like she hadn't vanished off-grid for 3 months. Same leather coat, same faint smirk. "You're early," she said. I stepped forward. "So are you." We didn't hug. We didn't need to. This was not a reunion. This was business. "Is it real?" I asked. She nodded. As real as the silence they paid for. I held out my hand. She gave me the drive. Encrypted. Untouched. Inside, names, routes, protocols enough to dismantle an entire smuggling network that stretched across 3 continents. Enough to protect a dozen diplomats who didn't even know they were targets. I looked her in the eye. "Why me?" She shrugged. "Because you don't flinch." She turned to leave. Stopped. "You're not what they say you know." I raised an eyebrow. "What do they say?" "That you're all ice and orders." "And what do you think?" She smiled faintly. "I think you're the storm before the silence." And then she was gone. I stood there for a second alone. Mist curling around my boots. And I realized maybe she wasn't wrong. Maybe I had become the thing I once feared. Untouchable. Unbending. Uninvited. But not invisible. Never again. As we drove back, Park asked carefully, "You ever think of going home?" "I did," I said. "For a few minutes. What happened?" I remembered why I left. We didn't speak after that, because there was nothing left to explain. Back at the compound, I handed the drive to Novak. He nodded, sealed it, said, "Well done." But it was more than that. It was trust spoken in few words. It was belonging earned through action, not legacy. I stepped outside as the clouds finally began to part. Somewhere out there, another party was probably beginning another photo op, another speech about dreams and degrees and futures that fit neatly in frames. I wouldn't be in those pictures, but I didn't need to be, because I knew something now. In a world of applause, I was built for silence, and silence had finally become mine to command. The official invitation arrived 3 days later. Heavy cardstock, gold-embossed seal, signed by a man who once told me to my face that the military wasn't a place for women like you. Now he was inviting me to speak, not at a base, not behind closed doors, but on stage. At the National Security Summit, in front of cameras, senators, generals, foreign attachés, and apparently my father. He would be attending as a guest of one of the defense panel sponsors. Poetic. I didn't hesitate. Not because I wanted him to see me, but because I no longer needed him not to. This wasn't about him anymore. It was about me. The flight to DC was short. Efficient. I reviewed the agenda once, then set it down. The words were simple. Keynote address, Commander Emma Carter. Topic: Leadership under silence, protecting what you can't name. They'd let me write the title. I meant every word of it. I arrived early, not because I was nervous, but because I wanted to walk the halls alone first, feel the weight of the history I was about to stand inside. The air was different here, heavy with consequence, laced with ambition. But I wasn't intimidated. I'd faced worse in caves with no lights, in languages I didn't speak, with people I didn't trust. This was just noise. An hour before the speech, a staffer handed me the final seating chart. I scanned it briefly. There he was. David Carter. Row 4, seat 6. And beside him, Abigail Carter. Of course, somewhere along the way, they'd begun calling her Dr. Carter, even though her dissertation had been ghostwritten. I didn't care. Titles didn't scare me anymore. I had earned mine in fire. Backstage, the tech crew attached my mic. Final checks. The director, a young woman with sharp eyes, smiled nervously. "Commander," she whispered. "You ready?" I smiled. "Always." They announced my name. Applause. I stepped into the light, not for drama, but for reckoning. The stage was vast, the room larger than it seemed on paper. But my eyes went straight to row 4, to his face, and hers. My father didn't move, not even a blink. Abigail's smile twitched like it couldn't decide whether to hide or stretch. I began. Not with rank, not with titles, with silence. 10 seconds. 20. The room held its breath. Then I spoke. "Silence is often mistaken for weakness," I said. "But in this line of work, it's the most powerful weapon you have." And then I told them a story about a mission that never made the news, about a name that was never printed, about the cost of carrying truth when no one wants to hear it. I didn't name countries. I didn't name enemies. But I named consequences for every sleepless night, every mistake I had to own, every life I tried to save and sometimes couldn't. And then I said this: I've sat in banquet halls where my name wasn't on the list. I've stood outside ceremonies I helped make possible. I've listened to family members toast futures they never thought I was part of. And I never interrupted, because I knew someday I wouldn't have to. The room was silent. I looked again at row 4. My father's jaw was tight, his eyes unreadable. Abigail looked down. I ended with no flourish, no raise in voice, just one truth. Respect is not inherited. It's not gifted. It's not given because you share blood or stories or photos. It's earned. And today, I no longer need to earn it from anyone in this room. I stepped back. Applause thundered. Not forced. Not polite. Earned. Backstage, someone reached for my hand. Another staffer, eyes wide. "Ma'am," she whispered. That was... I've never seen anything like that. I nodded. Because I had. I'd seen it in the mirror. For years. As I walked toward the exit, a tap on my shoulder stopped me. I turned. He stood there. My father. Older now. Thinner. A little gray in the beard he used to keep clean shaven. He opened his mouth, closed it. "Then Emma." I waited. "I didn't know." "You never asked." He nodded slowly. "Tried again. We were wrong." I looked at him, not with anger, but with distance. "You weren't wrong," I said. "You just never looked close enough to know." He swallowed, tried to hold my gaze. Failed. I walked past him. He didn't follow. And that was the difference now. Once I would have wanted him to. Now, I knew the story had already been told, and I had told it. On my terms, in my voice, with no one left to silence me. The car ride back from the summit was silent. Not the tense kind of silence, not anymore. It was calm, still, like the wind after a storm. I watched the buildings pass outside the window. The marble, the columns, the white stone that Washington loved so much. All those symbols of order and power. I'd spoken among them now, not just spoken. Commanded! My phone buzzed. A dozen messages. Reporters, colleagues, strangers from past assignments somehow finding my number just to say, "I didn't know. I'm proud of you." But one message stopped me. From Abigail. Just 2 words. I saw. That was all. No apology. No question. No defense. Just those 2 words loaded with the weight of everything she never said when it mattered. I didn't respond. Because there was nothing left to say, not between us. When I got back to my hotel, I changed out of the uniform slowly. Folded it with care like always. Laid it flat across the dresser. Then I sat down still in the undershirt and stared out the window. The sky was turning. That violet hour when the light goes soft and everything looks like memory. I thought of my childhood bedroom, of the walls once covered in Abigail's certificates, ribbons, plaques. Mine had been blank. I thought of the way they clapped when she got accepted into law school, and how no one asked where I was stationed that year. I thought of birthday dinners I missed, weddings I was never invited to, and the funeral I couldn't attend because the mission couldn't wait. And yet, I'd always told myself it's okay. They just don't understand. But maybe they never wanted to. Maybe it was easier to pretend I'd failed than to accept they'd underestimated me. That night, I didn't sleep much. Not because I was restless, but because I didn't need the comfort of dreams anymore. Reality had finally given me what dreams never did: clarity. The next morning, I walked down to the lobby, checked out early. The concierge handed me a note, no sender listed. Just my name handwritten. I opened it. The handwriting was familiar. My mother's. I watched your speech. I don't know how to say I'm sorry, but I hope it's not too late to try. Mom. I held the note for a long time, not because it hurt, but because it didn't, because this time I could see it for what it was, a gesture. Not a rewrite, not a repair, just a signal feint, maybe sincere, maybe not, that they had seen me. Finally. And that was enough. Not for reunion, not for return, but for release. I walked out into the street and breathed deep. The city smelled like concrete exhaust and the first heat of summer. I liked it. It smelled like movement. A cab pulled up. I gave the address without thinking. It was time, not to go back, but to go forward. At the train station, I boarded a line heading west. Far west. No destination programmed into my phone. No mission received blinking in my inbox. Just a train, just time, just me. Somewhere around mile 45, I pulled out my notebook. Not the encrypted field log, just the old one. The one I used when I still believed writing could soften the weight. I wrote, "There is a strange peace in being forgotten. Because once you are forgotten, you are free to become whoever you were always meant to be." I closed the notebook and leaned back, watched the trees blur past the window. Somewhere far behind me, the people who once called me a ghost were now trying to remember who I had been all along. But I wasn't that girl anymore. I wasn't a name they forgot to include on the guest list. I wasn't a rank they whispered about over dinner. I wasn't a surprise. I was certainty. I was legacy. I was the sum of every mile walked alone and every truth carried in silence. I closed my eyes, not to disappear, but to listen. Because sometimes when the world finally sees you, you no longer need to see it back. And that perhaps is the purest kind of power. The train rolled into a small town I didn't know the name of. It was the kind of place with one diner, one post office, and a library that probably hadn't changed since the 1960s. I stepped onto the platform without a suitcase. Just a backpack, just breath, just me. No one was waiting. And that was perfect. For the first time in years, I didn't need a mission briefing or an encrypted call. I didn't need to memorize a cover story or watch shadows for signs of a tale. I wasn't being followed. I wasn't reporting in. I was free. I walked until I found a coffee shop that smelled like wood and rain. The kind where people read actual newspapers. I sat by the window, ordered black coffee, and opened my notebook. Pages of thoughts, moments, fragments of silence I'd carried for too long. I wrote slowly. There is no glory in being unseen. Only growth. Quiet, painful, earned growth. I didn't write about the speech, or my father's face, or the way Abigail had frozen when I said my name into the microphone and the room rose to its feet. They had been trying to teach me that I was forgettable, but I had learned how to be unforgettable instead. And that was the lesson, one I hoped no one else would have to learn the hard way. My phone buzzed. Again. This time, It was a message from someone unexpected. From Abigail, I've told everyone the truth about who you are, about what I did. I don't expect anything, but I thought you should know. No apology, no excuses, just truth. Late but honest. I stared at the screen for a long time. Then I typed a single line. Thank you for finally looking, and I turned the phone off.
For good.
Outside, the rain started again, soft, steady. I smiled. Rain used to feel like sadness to me.
Now it felt like return.
The waitress came by and refilled my coffee.
Big plans, she asked.
I shook my head, just letting life catch up. She smiled, then walked away. And I sat there not as a soldier, not as a sister, not even as Commander Emma Carter, but as myself. Just Emma? And in that stillness, I realized something important.
Revenge doesn't always look like confrontation.
Sometimes it looks like rising. Sometimes it looks like being seen fully finally on your own terms. And sometimes
it looks like leaving the past behind without needing it to chase after you.
I picked up my cup, watched the steam curl into the air, and I whispered quietly, like a prayer no one needed to hear. I'm not outside anymore. Then I stood up and walked into the rest of my life.